We, in our study on the Gospel of Matthew, find ourselves in Matthew chapter 5, and we are going to read verses 17 to 20, and I'm going to be reading it in J.B. Phillips' translation. J.B. Phillips wrote his translation in the era of the Second World War as an attempt to provide a modern English translation for the people that he worked with in England. You must not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to complete them. Indeed, I assure you that while heaven and earth last, the law will not lose a single dot or comma until its purpose is complete. This means that whoever now relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches men to do the same will himself be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever teaches and practices them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that your goodness must be far better than that goodness of the scribes and Pharisees before you can set foot in the kingdom of heaven at all. I did not grow up in the church. Details are a little fuzzy at this point, but basically my family stopped going to church by the time I started public school, shortly thereafter. I resumed church attendance at the age of 17. And several months after I started going to church, I committed my life to Christ. The reason this is important is to understand me, is to understand that culturally I did not grow up in the church. And so therefore I don't have that kind of innate sense of the church culture that somebody growing up in the church does. When I worked as a pastor, this sometimes created problems for me. You see, I would assume that people in an evangelical church setting would actually believe in the Bible. But what I discovered is that people who grow up in the church may just as well not believe so much in the Bible, but believe in the interpretation of the Bible in the era that they grew up in the church. How do you talk of the faith to people in the church who have an understanding of the Bible that is not biblical? If you want to understand the issues that Jesus had with the Pharisees, understand that their interpretation of the Bible got in the way of their understanding the Bible. I find it fascinating that Jesus continually attacked their view of Scripture, but he did not do so by debating them on it. In a number of healings, Jesus did the act of healing on a Sabbath. I'm not saying this is the only reason he did his healings this way, but it is a relevant example for what we are saying in this paragraph. You see, it was an attack on their view of Scripture. Now, notice Jesus did not argue chapter and verse. He went out and healed someone on the Sabbath. Nothing can be more infuriating than someone who does not argue on your terms. Jesus was challenging their interpretation of Scripture, but in a way that their rebuttals made them look stupid. Do you think the average person in Jesus' day cared that it was a Sabbath, that a person was healed? Do you not think they were just glad that the person could talk, walk, or was now well of body and soul and mind? Do you think they really cared with the intricacies of Sabbath law at that point? Jesus could not and would not challenge the Pharisees on their view of Scripture. You see, what happens in the faith is that the faith community can twist what is said in the good book to justify who and what they are. Instead of being used as the fountainhead for creating a faithful, loving community who actively share the faith with the world it is in, the good book becomes a means for us to be elevated above the common rabble of the world we are in. Jesus understood that the misuse of Scripture and the misapplication of it leads to dysfunctional faith and practice. The purpose of this book is to call us to a life of faith and service, which in turn calls us to live out that faith in the world we find ourselves in. Verse 20 is important to understanding what Jesus is driving at. To the people of that day, the Pharisees were people of exemplary righteousness. They had really good lives and lifestyles. Jesus did not challenge their morality as such. He could not. They tended to be very moral and upright people. Notice that morality did not make them righteous. You see, Jesus did not tell us to be more moral than these people. He called us to be more righteous. Morality centers on me, but righteousness centers on God. To be righteous is to live right with God. The twisted scriptural exegesis of the Pharisees led to a faith centered on themselves, not God. An interpretation of scripture that does not lead us into a deeper faith and a deeper commitment to follow Jesus and live our lives for God. And as a result, to go back into that world with that life and message is not a biblical message that is of God.